Over it's no way. It's this pit's lonesome, and we might lose our way. Where we'd come to, the Lord only knows. Nevertheless, said Haley, I shall go that way. Now I think on it, I think I heard them tell that Dart our road was all fenced, up and down by the creek, and there aren't it, Andy? Andy wasn't certain. He'd only heard tell about that road, but never been over it. In short, he was strictly non-committal. Haley, accustomed to strike the balance of probabilities between lines of greater or lesser magnitude, thought that it lay in favor of the dirt road aforesaid. The mention of the thing he thought he perceived was involuntary on Sam's part at first, and his confused attempts to dissuade him he sat down to a desperate line on second thoughts, as being unwilling to implicate Eliza. When, therefore, Sam indicated the road, Haley plunged briskly into it, followed by Sam and Andy. Now the road, in fact, was an old one, that had formerly been a thoroughfare to the river, but abandoned for many years after the laying of the new pike. It was open for about an hour's ride, and after that it was cut across by various farms and fences. Sam knew these facts perfectly well. Indeed, the road had been so long closed up that Andy had never heard of it. He therefore rode along with an air of dutiful submission, only groaning and vociferating occasionally that was despiteful and bad for Jerry's foot. "Now I just give yer warning," said Haley. "I know yer won't get me to turn off this yer road, with all yer function, so you shut up." "Master will go his own way," said Sam, with rueful submission, at the same time winking most portentously to Andy, whose delight was now very near the explosive point. Sam was in wonderful spirits, professed to keep a very brisk look-out, at one time exclaiming that he saw a gal's bonnet on the top of some distant eminence, or calling to Andy, if that there wasn't Lizzie, down in the hollow, always making these exclamations in some rough or craggy part of the road, where the sudden quickening of speed was a special inconvenience to all parties concerned, and thus keeping Haley in a state of constant commotion. After riding about an hour in this way, the whole party made a precipitate and tumultuous descent into a barn-yard belonging to a large farming establishment. Not a soul was in sight, all the hands being employed in the fields. But as the barn stood conspicuously and plainly square across the road, it was evident that their journey in that direction had reached a decided finale. "Wasn't that what I telled Mas'r?" said Sam, with an air of injured innocence. "How does strange gentlemen beg to know more about a country than the natives born and raised?" "You rascal," said Halley, "you knew all about this." "Didn't I tell yer I knowed, and yer wouldn't believe me. I telled master was all shut up, and fenced up, and I didn't 'spect we could get through. Andy heard me." It was all too true to be disputed, and the unlucky man had to pocket his wrath with the best grace he was able, and all three faced to the right about, and took up their line of march for the highway. In consequence of all the various delays, it was about 3/4 of an hour after Eliza had laid her child to sleep in the village tavern that the party came riding into the same place. Eliza was standing by the window, looking out in another direction, when Sam's quick eye caught a glimpse of her. Halley and Andy were 2 yards behind. At this crisis, Sam contrived to have his hat blown off, and uttered a loud and characteristic ejaculation, which startled her at once. She drew suddenly back, the whole train swept by the window, ran to the front door. A thousand lives seemed to be concentrated in that one moment to Eliza. Her room opened by a side door to the river. She caught her child, and sprang down the steps towards it. The trader caught a full glimpse of her, just as she was disappearing down the bank, and throwing himself from his horse, and calling loudly on Sam and Andy. He was after her like a hound after a deer. In that dizzy moment her feet to her scarce seemed to touch the ground, and a moment brought her to the water's edge. Right on behind they came, and nerved with strength such as God gives only to the desperate. With one wild cry and flying leap, she vaulted sheer over the turbid current by the shore, onto the raft of ice beyond. It was a desperate leap, impossible to anything but madness and despair, and Halley, Sam and Andy instinctively cried out, and lifted up their hands as she did it. The huge green fragment of ice on which she alighted pitched and creaked as her weight came on it, but she stayed there not a moment. With wild cries and desperate energy, she leaped to another, and still another cake. Stumbling, leaping, slipping, springing upwards again. Her shoes are gone. Her stockings cut from her feet, while blood marks every step. But she saw nothing, felt nothing, till dimly, as in a dream, she saw the Ohio side, and a man helping her up the bank. "You're a brave girl, now whoever ye," said the man with an oath. Eliza recognized the voice and face of a man who owned a farm not far from her old home. "Oh, Mr. Sims, save me, do save me, do hide me," said Eliza. "Why, what's this?" said the man. "Why, if 'tain't Shelby's gal, my child, this boy. He'd sold him. This is his master," said she, pointing to the Kentucky shore. "Oh, Mr. Sims, you've got a little boy." "So I have," said the man, as he roughly but kindly drew her up the steep bank. "Besides, you're a right brave gal. I like grit, wherever I see it." When they had gained the top of the bank, the man paused. "I'd be glad to do something for ye," said he, "but then there's nowhere I could take ye. The best I can do is to tell ye to go there," said he, pointing to a large white house which stood by itself off the main street of the village. "Go there. They're kind folks. There's no kind of danger but they'll help you. They're up to all that sort of thing." "The Lord bless you," said Eliza, earnestly. "No occasion, no occasion in the world," said the man. "What I've done's of no 'count. And, oh, surely, sir, you won't tell any one. Go to thunder, gal. What do you take a feller for?" "In course not," said the man. "Come, now go along like a likely, sensible gal, as you are. You've earned your liberty, and you shall have it, for all me." The woman folded her child to her bosom, and walked firmly and swiftly away. The man stood and looked after her. Shelby, now, maybe won't think this yer the most neighborly thing in the world, but what's feller to do? If he catches one of my gals in the same fix, he's welcome to pay back." Somehow I never could see no kind of creature a striving and panting, and trying to clear themselves, with the dog arter them, and go agin them. Besides, I don't see no kind of 'casion for me to be hunter and catcher for other folks, neither." So spoke this poor, heavisome Kentuckian, who had not been instructed in his constitutional relations, and consequently was betrayed into acting in a sort of Christianized manner, which if he had been better situated, and more enlightened, he would not have been left to do. Haley had stood a perfectly amazed spectator of the scene, till Eliza had disappeared up the bank, when he turned a blank, inquiring look on Sam and Andy. "That was a tolerable fair stroke of business," said Sam. "The gal's got 7 devils in her, I believe," said Hallie. "How like a wild cat she jumped!" "Well, now," said Sam, scratching his head, "I hope Mas'r'll 'scuse us trying that ar road. Don't think I feel spry enough for Dater. No way," and Sam gave a hoarse chuckle. "You laugh," said the trader, with a growl. "Lord bless you, master, I couldn't help it now," said Sam, giving way to the long pent-up delight of his soul. She looked so curious, a-leaping and springing, eyes a-cracking, and only to hear her plump, ker-chunk, ker-splash, spring! Lord, how she goes it! And Sam and Andy laughed, till the tears rolled down their cheeks. "I'll make ye laugh t'other side yer mouths," said the trader, laying about their heads with his riding whip. Both ducked, and ran shouting up the bank, and were on their horses before he was up. "Good evening, master," said Sam, with much gravity. "I very much expect Missy be anxious about Jerry. Master Hallie won't want us no longer. Missus wouldn't hear of our riding the critters over the Lizzie's bridge to-night," and, with a facetious poke into Andy's ribs, he started off, followed by the latter, at full speed, their shouts of laughter coming faintly on the wind. The light of the cheerful fire shone on the rug and carpet of a cosy parlour, and glittered on the sides of the tea-cups and well-brightened tea-pot. As Senator Byrd was drawing off his boots, preparatory to inserting his feet in a pair of new handsome slippers, which his wife had been working for him while away on his senatorial tour, Mrs. Byrd, looking the very picture of delight, was superintending the arrangements of the table, ever and anon mingling admonitory remarks to a number of frolicsome juveniles, who were ever buzzing in all those modes of untold gambol and mischief that have astonished mothers ever since the flood. "Tom, let the door-knob alone. There's a man. Mary, Mary, don't pull the cat's tail. Poor pussy! Jim, you mustn't climb on that table. No, no, you don't know, my dear, what a surprise it is to us all to see you here tonight, said she, at last, when she found a space to say something to her husband. Yes, yes, I thought I'd just make a run down, spend the night, and have a little comfort at home. I'm tired to death, and my head aches. Mrs. Bird cast a glance at a camphor bottle, which stood in the half-open closet, and appeared to meditate an approach to it, but her husband interposed. No, no, Mary, no doctoring. A cup of your good hot tea, and some of our good home living, is what I want. It's a tiresome business, this legislating, and the senator smiled, as if he rather liked the idea of considering himself a sacrifice to his country. Well, said his wife, after the business of the tea-table was getting rather slack, and what have they been doing in the Senate? Now, it was a very unusual thing for gentle little Mrs. Bird ever to trouble her head with what was going on in the House of the State, very wisely considering that she had enough to do to mind her own. Mr. Bird, therefore, opened his eyes in surprise, and said, "Not very much of importance." "Well, but is it true that they have been passing a law forbidding people to give meat and drink to those poor colored folks that come along? I heard they were talking of some such law, but I didn't think any Christian legislature would pass it." "Why, Mary, you are getting to be a politician all at once." "No, nonsense. I wouldn't give a fig for all your politics, generally, but I think this is something downright cruel and unchristian. I hope, my dear, no such law has been passed." "Why, Mary, you are getting to be a politician. There has been a law passed forbidding people to help off the slaves. That's come over from Kentucky, my dear. So much of that thing has been done by these reckless abolitionists that our brethren in Kentucky are very strongly excited, and it seems necessary, and no more than Christian and kind, that something should be done by our state to quiet the excitement. And what is the law? It don't forbid us to shelter these poor creatures a night, does it? And to give them something comfortable to eat, and a few old clothes, and send them quietly about their business. Why, yes, my dear, that would be aiding and abetting, you know, and with mild blue eyes, and a peach blow complexion, and the gentlest, sweetest voice in the world. As for courage, a moderate-sized cock turkey had been known to put her to rout at the very first gobble, and a stout horse dog of moderate capacity would bring her into subjection merely by a show of his teeth. Her husband and children were her entire world, and in these she ruled more by entreaty and persuasion than by command or argument. There was only one thing that was capable of arousing her, and that provocation came in on the side of her unusually gentle and sympathetic nature, anything in the shape of cruelty. anything in the shape of cruelty would throw her into a passion, which was the more alarming and inexplicable to proportion to the general softness of her nature, generally the most indulgent and easy to be entreated of all mothers. Still her boys had a very reverent remembrance of a most vehement chastisement she once bestowed on them, because she found them leagued with several restless boys of the neighbourhood, stunning a defenceless kitten. "I'll tell you what," Master Bill used to say, "I was scared that time. Mother came at me so that I thought she was crazy, and I was whipped and tumbled off to bed without any supper before I could get over wondering what had come about, and after that I heard Mother crying outside the door, which made me feel worse than all the rest. I'll tell you what," he'd say, "we boys never stoned another kitten." On the present occasion, Mrs. Bird rose quickly, with very red cheeks, which quite improved her general appearance, and walked up to her husband with quite a resolute air, and said, in a determined tone, "Now, John, I want to know if you think such a law as that is right and Christian. You won't shoot me, now, Mary, if I say I do." "I never could have thought it of you, John. You didn't vote for it." "Even so, my fair politician, you ought to be ashamed, John. Poor, homeless, houseless creatures! It's a shameful, wicked, abom- abominable law, and I'll break it, for one, the first time I get a chance. and I hope I shall have a chance. I do. Things have got to a pretty pass. If a woman can't give a warm supper and a bed to poor, starving creatures, just because they are slaves, and have been abused and oppressed all their lives, poor things. But, Mary, just listen to me. Your feelings are all quite right, dear, and interesting, and I love you for them. But then, dear, we mustn't suffer our feelings to run away with our judgment. You must consider it's not a matter of private feeling. There are great public interests involved. There is such a state of public agitation rising, that we must put aside our private feelings. Now, John, I don't know anything about politics, but I can read my Bible, and there I see that I must feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and comfort the desolate, and that Bible I mean to follow. But in cases where your doing so would involve a great public evil, obeying God never brings on public evils. I know it can't. It's always safest, all round, to do as He bids us. Now, listen to me, Mary, and I can state to you a very clear argument to show. Oh, nonsense, John. You can talk all night, but you wouldn't do it. I put it to you, John. Would you now turn away a poor, shivering, hungry creature from your door, because he was a runaway? Would you, now? Now, if the truth must be told, our senator had the misfortune to be a man who had a particularly human and accessible nature, and turning away anybody that was in trouble never had been his forte, and what was worse for him in this particular pinch of the argument was, that his wife knew it, and, of course, was making an assault on rather an indefensible point. So he had recourse to the usual means of gaining time for such cases. Made and provided, he said ahem, and coughed several times, took out his pocket handkerchief, and began to wipe his glasses. Mrs. Bird, seeking the defenceless condition of the enemy's territory, had no more conscience than to push her advantage. "I should like to see you doing that, John. I really should. Turning a woman out of doors in a snowstorm, for instance. Or maybe you'd take her up and put her in jail, wouldn't you? You would make a great hand at that." "Of course, it would be a very painful duty," began Mr. Bird in a moderate tone. "Duty, John, don't use that word. You know it isn't a duty. It can't be a duty. If folks want to keep their slaves from running away, let them treat them well. That's my doctrine. If I had slaves, as I hope I never shall have, I'd risk their wanting to run away from me, or you either, John. I tell you folks don't run away when they are happy, and when they do run, poor creatures, they suffer enough with cold and hunger and fear, without everybody's turning against them. And, though or no law, I never will, so help me God. Mary, Mary, my dear, let me reason with you. I hate reasoning, John, especially reasoning on such subjects. There's a way you political folks have of coming round and round a plain right thing, and you don't believe in it yourselves when it comes to practice. I know you well enough, John. You don't believe it's right any more than I do, and you wouldn't do it any sooner than I. At this critical juncture, old Cudgel, the black man of all work, put his head in at the door, and wished Mrs. would come into the kitchen, and our senator, tolerably relieved, looked after his little wife with a whimsical mixture of amusement and vexation, and seating himself in the arm-chair, began to read the papers. After a moment, his wife's voice was heard at the door, in a quick, earnest tone. "John, John, I do wish you'd come here a moment." He laid down his paper, and went into the kitchen, and started, quite amazed at the sight that presented itself. A young and slender woman, with garments torn and frozen, with one shoe gone, and the stocking torn away from the cut and bleeding foot, was laid back in a deadly swoon upon 2 chairs. There was the impress of the desperate race on her face, yet none could help feeling its mournful and pathetic beauty, while its stony sharpness, its cold, fixed, deathly aspect, struck a solemn chill over him. He drew his breath short, and stood in silence. His wife, and their only coloured domestic, old Aunt Dinah, were busily engaged in restorative measures, while old Cudgel had got the boy on his knee, and was busy pulling off his shoes and stockings, and chafing his little cold feet. sure, now, if she aren't a sight to behold," said old Dinah, compassionately. "'Pears like 'twas the heat that made her faint. She was tolerable peart when she come in, and asked if she couldn't warm herself here a spell, and I was just a-asking her where she come from, and she fainted right down. Never done much hard work, guess, by the looks of her hands." "Poor creature!" said Mrs. Bird, compassionately, as the woman slowly unclosed her large dark eyes, and looked vacantly at her. Suddenly an expression of agony crossed her face, and she sprang up, saying, "Oh, my Harry, have they got him?" The boy, at this, jumped from Cudgel's knee, and, running to her side, put up his arms. "Oh, he's here! He's here!" she exclaimed. "Oh, ma'am," said she, wildly, to Mrs. Bird, "do protect us. Don't let them get him. Nobody shall hurt you here." "Poor woman," said Mrs. Bird, encouragingly, "you are safe. Don't be afraid." "God bless you," said the woman, covering her face and sobbing, while the little boy, seeing her crying, tried to get into her lap, with many gentle and womanly offices, which none knew better how to render than Mrs. Bird. The poor woman was, in time, rendered more calm. A contemporary bed was provided for her on the settle, near the fire, and, after a short time, she fell into a heavy slumber with the child, who seemed no less weary, soundly sleeping on her arm, for the mother resisted, with nervous anxiety, the kindest attempts to take him from her, and even in sleep, her arm encircled him with an unrelaxing clasp, as if she could not even then be beguiled of her vigilant hold. Mr. and Mrs. Bird had gone back to the parlour, where, strange as it may appear, no reference was made, on either side, to the preceding conversation, but Mrs. Bird busied herself with her knitting work, and Mr. Bird pretended to be reading the paper. "I wonder who and what she is," said Mr. Bird at last as he laid it down. "When she wakes up and feels a little rested, we will see," said Mrs. Bird. "I say, wife," said Mr. Bird, after musing in silence over his newspaper. "Well, dear, she couldn't wear one of your gowns, could she, by any letting down, or such matter? She seems to be rather larger than you are." A quite perceptible smile glimmered on Mrs. Bird's face as she answered, "We'll see." Another pause, and Mr. Bird again broke out, "I say, wife." "Well, what now?" "Why, there's that old bombazine cloak that you keep on purpose to put over me when I take my afternoon's nap. You might as well give her that. She needs clothes." At this instant Dinah looks in to say that the woman was awake, and wanted to see Mrs. Mr. and Mrs. Bird went into the kitchen, followed by the two eldest boys, the smaller fry having, by this time, been safely disposed of in bed. The woman was now sitting up on the settle, by the fire. She was looking from her former agitated wildness. "Did you want me?" said Mrs. Bird in gentle tones. "I hope you feel better now, poor woman." A long drawn, shivering sigh was the only answer, but she lifted her dark eyes, and fixed them on her with such a forlorn and imploring expression, that the tears came into the little woman's eyes. "You needn't be afraid of anything. We are friends here. Poor woman, tell me where you came from, and what you want," said she. "I came from Kentucky," said the woman. "When?" said Mr. Bird, taking up the interrogatory. "To-night." "How did you come?" "I crossed on the ice." "Crossed on the ice," said every one present. "Yes," said the woman, slowly, "I did. God helping me, I crossed on the ice, for they were behind me, right behind, and there was no other way, though, missus," said Kojo. The ice is all in broken up blocks, a swinging and a tottering up and down in the water. I know it was. I know it, said she, wildly, but I did it. I wouldn't have thought I could. I didn't think I should get over, but I didn't care. I could but die if I didn't. The Lord helped me. Nobody knows how much the Lord can help them till they try, said the woman, with a flashing eye. Were you a slave? Said Mr. Bird. Yes, sir. I belonged to a man in Kentucky. Was he unkind to you? No, sir. He was a good master. And was your mistress unkind to you? No, sir. No. My mistress was always good to me. What could induce you to leave a good home, then, and run away, and go through such dangers? The woman looked up at Mrs. Bird with a keen, scrutinizing glance, and it did not escape her that she was dressed in deep mourning. "Then," she said, suddenly, "have you ever lost a child?" The question was unexpected, and it was a thrust and a new wound, for it was only a month since a darling child of the family had been laid in the grave. Mr. Bird turned around and walked to the window, and Mrs. Bird burst into tears, but recovering her voice, she said, "Why do you ask that? I have lost a little one." "Then you will feel for me. I have lost two, one after another, left them buried there when I came away, and I had only this one left. I never slept a night without him. He was all I had. He was my comfort and pride, day and night. And madam, they were going to take him away from me, to sell him down south, madam, to go all alone, a baby that had never been away from his mother in his life. I couldn't stand it, madam. I knew I never should be good for anything, if they did, and when I knew the papers were signed, and he was sold, I took him and came off in the night, and they chased me, the man that bought me, and some of master's folks, and they were coming down right behind me, and I heard them. I jumped right on to the ice, and how I got across, I don't know, but first I knew a man was helping me up the bank. The woman did not sob nor weep. She had gone to a place where tears are dry, but every one around her was in some way characteristic of themselves, showing signs of hearty sympathy. The two little boys, after a desperate rummaging in their pockets, in search of those pocket handkerchiefs which mothers know are never to be found there, had thrown themselves disconsolately into the skirts of their mother's gown, where they were sobbing, and wiping their eyes and noses to their heart's content. Mrs. Bird had her face fairly hidden in her pocket handkerchief, and all dinner, with tears streaming down her black, honest face, was ejaculating, "Lord have mercy on us!" with all the fervour of a camp meeting, while old Kojo, rubbing his eyes very hard with her cuffs, and making a most uncommon variety of weary faces, occasionally responded in the same key, with great fervour. Our senator was a statesman, and of course could not be expected to cry, like other mortals, and so he turned his back to the company, and looked out of the window, and seemed particularly busy in clearing his throat, and wiping his spectacle glasses, occasionally blowing his nose in a manner that was calculated to excite suspicion, had any one been in a state to observe critically. How come you to tell me you had a kind master? He suddenly exclaimed, gulping down very resolutely some kind of rising in his throat, and turning suddenly round upon the woman. Because he was a kind master. I'll say that of him, anyway. And my mistress was kind. But they couldn't help themselves. They were owing money, and there was some way, I can't tell how, that a man had a hold on them, and they were obliged to give him his will. I listened, and heard him telling mistress that, and she begging and pleading for me, and he told her he couldn't help himself, and that the papers were all drawn, and then it was I took him, and left my home, and came away. I knew was no use of my trying to leave, if they didn't, for it 'pears like this child is all I have. Have you no husband? Yes, but he belongs to another man. His master is real hard to him, and won't let him come to see me, hardly ever, and he's grown harder and harder upon us, and he threatens to sell him down south. It's like I'll never see him again. The quiet tone in which the woman pronounced these words might have led a superficial observer to think that she was entirely apathetic, but there was a calm, settled depth of anguish in her large, dark eye, that spoke of something far otherwise. "And there and where do you mean to go, my poor woman?" said Mrs. Bird. "To Canada. If I only knew where that was. Is it very far off, is Canada?" said she, looking up, with a simple, confiding air, to Mrs. Bird's face. "Poor thing!" said Mrs. Bird, involuntarily. "Isn't a very great way off, think?" said the woman, earnestly. "Much further than you think, poor child," said Mrs. Bird. "But we will try to think what can be done for you. Here, Dinah, make her up a bed in your own room, close by the kitchen, and I'll think what to do for her in the morning. Meanwhile, never fear, poor woman, put your trust in God. He will protect you." Mrs. Bird and her husband re-entered the parlour. She sat down in her little rocking chair before the fire, swaying thoughtfully to and fro. Mr. Bird strode up and down the room, grumbling to himself. "Pish, pshaw! Confounded old awkward business!" At length, striding up to his wife, he said, "I say, wife, she'll have to get away from here this very night. That fellow will be down on the sands bright and early to morrow morning. If it was only the woman, she could lie quiet till it was over, but that little chap can't be kept still by a troop of horse and foot. I will warrant me, he'll bring it all out. popping his head out of some window or door. A pretty kettle of fish it would be for me, too, to be caught with them both here, just now. No, they'll have to be got off to-night. To-night? How is it possible? Where to? Well, I know pretty well where to, said the senator, beginning to put on his boots, with a reflective air, and stopping when his leg was half in. He embraced his knee with both hands, and seemed to go off in deep meditation. "It's a confounded awkward, ugly business," said he, at last, beginning to tug at his boot straps again, "and there's a fact. After one boot was fairly on," the senator sat with the other in his hand, profoundly studying the figure of the carpet, "it will have to be done, though, for all I see. Hang it all!" and he drew the other boot anxiously on, and looked out of the window. Now, little Mrs. Bird was a discreet woman, a woman who never in her life said, "I told you so," and on the present occasion, though pretty well aware of the shape her husband's meditations were taking, she very prudently forbore to meddle with them, only sat very quietly in her chair, and looked quite ready to hear her liege lord's intentions, where she should think proper to alter them. "You see," he said, "there's my old client, Ventnor, has come over from Kentucky, and set all his slaves free, and he was bought a place 7 miles up the creek, here, back in the woods, where nobody goes, unless they go on purpose, and it's a place that isn't found in a hurry. There she'd be safe enough, but the plague of the thing is, nobody could drive a carriage there to-night but me." "Why not? Cudgel is an excellent driver." "Ay, but here it is. The creek has to be crossed twice, and the second crossing is quite dangerous, unless one knows it as I do. I have crossed it 100 times on horseback, and know exactly the turns to take. And so, you see, there's no help for it. Cudgel must put in the horses, as quietly as may be, about 12 o'clock, and I'll take her over, and then to give Cather to the mater, he must carry me on to the next tavern, to take the stage for Columbus, that comes by about 3 or 4. And so it will look as if I had had the carriage only for that. I shall get into business bright and early in the morning, but I'm thinking I shall feel rather cheap there. After all that's been said and done, but hang it, I can't help it. Your heart is better than your head in this case, John, said the wife, laying her little white hand on his. Could I ever have loved you, had I not known you better than you know yourself? And the little woman looked so handsome, with the tears sparkling in her eyes, that the senator thought he must be a decidedly clever fellow, to get such a pretty creature into such a passionate admiration of him. And so, what could he do but walk off soberly, to see about the carriage? At the door, however, he stopped a moment, and then coming back, he said, with some hesitation, "Mary, I don't know how you'd feel about it, but there's that drawer full of things, of of poor little Henry's." So saying, he turned quickly on his heel, and shut the door after him. His wife opened the little bedroom door adjoining her room, and taking the candle, set it down on the top of a bureau there. Then from a small recess she took a key, and put it thoughtfully in the lock of a drawer, and made a sudden pause, while two boys, who, boy-like, had followed close on her heels, stood looking with silent, significant glances at their mother. And oh, mother that read this, has there never been in your house a drawer, or a closet, the opening of which has been to you like the opening again of a little grave? Ah, happy mother that you are, if it has not been so. Mrs. Bird slowly opened the drawer. There were little coats of many a form and pattern, piles of aprons, and rows of small stockings, and even a pair of little shoes, worn and rubbed at the toes, were peeping from the folds of a paper. There was a toy horse and wagon, a top, a ball, memorials gathered, with many a tear and many a heartbreak. She sat down by the drawer, and leaning her head on her hands over it, wept till the tears fell through her fingers into the drawer. Then suddenly raising her head, she began with nervous haste, selecting the plainest and most substantial articles, and gathering them into a bundle.